The morning Opal Hendricks got called a liability to the firm's image. She was holding a coffee she hadn't even had a chance to drink yet. It was 7:42. The elevator doors had barely closed on the 41st floor of the Harrington Voss Financial Tower in downtown Toronto when her supervisor, a man named Aldridge Croft, who wore cufflinks to casual Fridays, turned to the three colleagues standing behind her and said, loud enough that she could hear every word reflected back in the polished steel doors, "Management is worried about optics. You know how it is. Client-facing roles need a certain presentation." Nobody said her name. Nobody had to. Opal stared at her own reflection in the elevator doors. Dark curls she'd pinned up in a hurry. Reading glasses pushed to the top of her head. A blazer that had fit better 6 months ago before she'd stopped sleeping properly and started eating her feelings in the form of Tim Hortons Timbits at her desk. She watched the woman in the reflection breathe in slowly and decide, for the 47th time that year, not to say anything. She was 31 years old, the only senior forensic risk analyst on the entire floor who had never once made an error on a client file. And she was invisible. That had been the arrangement, unspoken and absolute, since the day she'd been hired. Opal had come to Harrington Voss straight out of her master's at Waterloo on a referral from her thesis supervisor. Her work on structured financial fraud patterns had been described in her hiring letter as exceptional. Within 3 months, her analysis had saved the firm from a class action lawsuit they hadn't even known was coming. Nobody had said her name at the all-hands meeting when they announced the save. They'd credited the department. She had a whiteboard in her office covered in connection maps she drew in different colors depending on the type of risk. Her lunch was always at her desk. She ran on 4 hours of sleep and a very specific playlist she called background math music that she'd never told anyone about because nobody had ever asked. She was meticulous. She was thorough. She was, as Aldridge Croft had explained to a client once while walking past her open door without breaking stride, one of our back-end people. She had heard that too. What she had not heard, what nobody in the building had heard, was the reason a man named Severin Galt had booked a last-minute consultation with the firm's managing director that same Tuesday morning. Severin Galt did not book consultations. He did not fill out intake forms or wait in reception areas or allow his name to appear in appointment logs. The fact that his assistant had called at all meant something had already gone badly wrong somewhere. And the managing director, a panicked man named Tolliver, had spent the 40 minutes before the meeting sweating through his collar and telling his PA to make sure the good coffee was out. Opal only knew any of this because her office shared a ventilation shaft with the boardroom, a fact she had never mentioned and had made quiet use of for 2 years running. She heard Galt's voice before she saw him, low, deliberate, the kind of voice that didn't need to raise itself because everything in the room had already gone still. Someone on your staff accessed a partition of the Vero Group ledger that they had no authorization to touch, he said. I want to know who, and I want to know what they found. The Vero Group. Opal stopped typing. She knew that name. She knew it the way a doctor knows the name of a pathogen, from careful study at a careful distance. The Vero Group was listed in Harrington Voss's client records as a Luxembourg-based private equity firm with interests in commercial real estate and hospitality. On paper, it was immaculate. The kind of immaculate that only existed when someone very talented had spent a very long time making it look that way. She had flagged it 8 months ago in an internal memo that had been marked noted, and filed somewhere to die quietly. She pulled up the memo now. Then she pulled up the Vero ledger partition she had accessed as part of a routine audit cross-check. Then she sat very still and thought about the fact that Severin Galt, whose name appeared in exactly 0 of the firm's public-facing documents, but whose signature was on the Vero incorporation papers, if you knew where to look, was currently 30 feet away from her, asking about her. He didn't know it was her yet. That was the only advantage she had, and she understood with perfect clarity that it had a shelf life measured in minutes. She was already building the map in her head when Aldridge Croft opened her office door without knocking. "Tolliver wants you in the boardroom," he said. He didn't look at her face when he said it. "Bring your audit files on the Vero's account." He said it like she was being sent to photocopy something. She brought the files. She also, in the 30 seconds she had between standing up and walking out her office door, forwarded 3 specific documents to an encrypted personal archive she maintained on a server that had nothing to do with Harrington Voss. Not because she was planning anything, because she had learned, somewhere in the last 2 years of being overlooked and talked over and walked past, that the only person who was ever going to protect Opal Hendricks was Opal Hendricks. The boardroom was cold and smelled like expensive coffee nobody had touched. Tolliver was at the head of the table, looking like a man who had already decided to throw someone under a bus and was just waiting to confirm the throwing angle. Aldridge was to his left, posture arranged into something that read as supportive, but was actually just positioning himself to step aside quickly. 2 men she didn't recognize stood near the window, large, unhurried, the kind of still that wasn't passive, and then there was Severin Gault. He was standing at the far end of the table with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he was looking at her the way she looked at financial discrepancies, with a focused, unrushed attention that meant he was already assembling something in his mind, and she was a variable he hadn't accounted for. He was not what she had expected. She hadn't expected much, in fairness. The name had conjured something older, softer. This man was neither. Late 30s, maybe 40, sharp in a way that had nothing to do with his suit. A scar along the left side of his jaw that had healed clean but hadn't been treated quickly. Eyes that were very dark and not particularly warm, and were, at this precise moment, entirely focused on her. "Miss Hendricks," Tolliver said, "thank you for coming," as though she'd had a choice. "The Vero audit," he continued. "There seems to have been an irregularity in how the file was accessed. An unauthorized deep partition pull that triggered a security flag on our client's end." He was talking to the table. "I need to understand what you were doing and why." It was not a question. It was a preamble to an answer he had already written for her. She understood then, with the same cool clarity she applied to everything, that Tolliver was going to tell her she'd made an unauthorized access error. She was going to apologize for it. They were going to hand her professional reputation over to Severin Gault as a peace offering, and she was going to be terminated by end of business. That was the plan. Everyone in the room except her had agreed to it before she walked in. She set her files on the table. "The partition pull was part of a routine anomaly trace," she said. "It was authorized under Section 4 of the firm's internal audit protocol, which permits secondary access to client subaccounts when a pattern of recursive microtransactions is flagged. I flagged that pattern 8 months ago." She opened the top file and slid it across the table toward Tolliver without looking at him. "I have the memo. Time-stamped. Your signature is on the acknowledgement." Silence. Tolliver looked at the memo. Then he looked at Aldridge. Aldridge had developed a sudden interest in the window. Severin Gault had not moved. He was still watching her. The quality of his attention had changed in some way she couldn't fully name. It had sharpened, or maybe it had deepened, like something behind his eyes had leaned forward. "What pattern?" he said. It wasn't directed at Tolliver. It wasn't directed at anyone in the room except her. She looked at him directly. Recursors, split-entry transfers, structured to stay below the beneficial ownership reporting threshold. They cycle through 4 shell entities before consolidating back into the Vero parent account. It's a clean wash cycle, very clean, but the entry timestamps have a 6-minute lag on every 3rd iteration that doesn't match the stated time zones of the intermediary accounts. She paused. "Whoever built it is excellent, but they've been running it long enough to develop a rhythm, and rhythms are visible if you know what you're looking for." Nobody spoke. One of the men by the window shifted his weight slightly. The other one didn't. Gault took his hands out of his pockets. He walked to the table, not toward Tolliver, not toward the files, toward her, stopping on the opposite side of the table with 2 meters of mahogany between them. He was looking at her the way people didn't usually look at her, which was to say, like she was the most important thing in the room. 6-minute lag, he repeated, on every 3rd iteration. Yes, you said you flagged this 8 months ago. I did, and nobody acted on it. She didn't look at Tolliver. Nobody acted on it. Something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile. It was harder than a smile and colder, and it was gone before she could be sure she'd seen it. Mrs. Hendricks, he said, I think you and I need to have a different conversation. That was how it started. It did not start with attraction, or at least not the kind that anyone watching from outside would have recognized as such. It started with Opal being escorted, not unkindly but not optionally, to a different meeting room on a different floor, where Golt's people had set up a clean laptop and a privacy screen and a notepad, and where Severin Golt sat across from her for 2.5 hours and asked her questions about the Vero's accounts that nobody else in the building had known to ask. She answered them. She answered them not because she was afraid, though there was a version of her that understood she probably should be, but because the questions were good questions and the pattern she'd been sitting on for 8 months was finally being taken seriously by someone with the capacity to do something about it. He didn't explain who he was. He didn't explain why he was there. She had a reasonable working theory, and she kept it to herself. At one point, he asked her to walk him through the recursive cycle from the beginning, and she stood up and drew it on the whiteboard in the corner of the room in the same color-coded system she used at her desk, narrating as she went, and when she turned around, he was watching her with that same focused, unreadable attention he'd had in the boardroom. You built this from public-facing data and a flagged memo, he said, and about 60 hours of cross-referencing that I did on evenings and weekends because I couldn't get anyone here to authorize the time. Why did you keep going? She considered the question. Because the numbers were wrong, she said, and wrong numbers don't stay wrong quietly. They eventually break something. He was quiet for a moment. What would you need, he said, to trace where the consolidated funds are actually going? She didn't hesitate. Full read access to the Vero sub-trust records, the intermediary account logs from all 4 shells, and about 48 hours. I can get you the access. She looked at him. In exchange for what, she said. He almost smiled again. Not warm, not unkind. Something in between that she didn't have a category for yet. In exchange for you using it to finish what you started. She should have asked more questions. She knew that. She asked one. The people who built this wash cycle, she said, are they dangerous? Extremely. Are you more dangerous than they are? This time he did smile. Just barely. Just enough. Yes. She turned back to the whiteboard. Then I need coffee, a second monitor, and for nobody to walk in and out of this room for the next 2 days. He arranged all 3. She did not go home. She did not call anyone. She ate vending machine food and drank bad coffee from a machine down the hall, and she worked, the way she had always worked, with the full and focused weight of a mind that had spent years being underestimated and had learned, in that underestimation, to be very, very thorough. Golt checked in twice a day, not hovering, appearing, asking 1 or 2 precise questions, reviewing what she'd mapped, leaving. He did not bring her food or ask if she was sleeping or make small talk. She found this restful. She had learned over the years that when people made small talk with her, it was usually in lieu of listening to her. This man listened. On the second evening, he came in to find her standing at the whiteboard with a marker in each hand and a look on her face he apparently hadn't seen before, because he stopped in the doorway and said, "What did you find?" "The funds don't terminate with the Vero group," she said. They never did. Vero is a transit point. The final consolidation is going to a numbered trust registered in Quebec, and the beneficial owner of that trust is also the signatory on a discretionary account at this firm. She put the red marker down. Someone on the inside has been routing the wash cycle through Harrington Voss deliberately, using the firm as a layer of legitimacy while skimming 3% on every pass. She turned around. "Your firm has a mole," she said, "and they've been here for at least 4 years." Galt was very still in the doorway. "Can you prove it?" he said. She held up the stack of printouts in her left hand. "I already did." He crossed the room in 4 strides, took the documents and read them standing up in silence for 4 full minutes. She watched him read. She watched the stillness in him shift into something tighter, more control. When he looked up, he was looking at her the way he'd looked at her in the boardroom, except there was something different in it now, something that had come from 48 hours of watching her work. "Opal," he said. It was the first time he'd used her first name. In his voice it landed differently than it did when anyone else said it, like it was a word he'd decided to keep. "You just handed me something that 3 of my own people have been trying to find for 18 months. "I know," she said. "I could tell by the questions you were asking. You knew the cycle existed. You didn't know the inside layer. How could you tell? Because you asked about the lag times twice, once casually, once precisely. The first time was to see if I'd noticed. The second time, he was quiet for a moment. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You owe me a job," she said. "The one I'm definitely losing before Friday." He sat down across from her, and for the first time in 2 days, he told her who he was. The Vero Group was not a client of Harrington Voss. It was a surveillance architecture, a constructed entity that Galt's organization had spent 18 months embedding in the firm's client list to draw out whoever was running the internal skimming operation. The whole thing had been a very expensive, very patient trap, and it had almost been compromised when whoever was running the inside layer had noticed the deep partition pull and panicked, prompting the phone call to Tolliver and the meeting that had put Opal in a room with Severin Galt. "So I accidentally walked into your trap," she said. "You walked into the part of my trap I hadn't been able to set," he said, "the inside connection. I couldn't get to it without access to the firm's internal audit trail, and I didn't have anyone with the authorization or the expertise to read it properly." He looked at her steadily. "And then there was you." She thought about 8 months of a memo nobody had read, 60 hours of unpaid cross-referencing, a whiteboard full of color-coded connection maps that Aldridge Croft had once called decorative. "What happens to the mole?" she asked. "They've already been identified. They'll be dealt with." She decided not to ask what that meant. She had a sense she already knew. And Tolliver knew enough to be negligent, and not enough to be prosecuted. He'll resign within the week. He paused. "His parting memo will credit the fraud identification to your department. Will it include my name?" Something shifted in his expression. "What would you like it to say?" She thought about that for a long moment. "I'd like it to say the forensic risk analysis was conducted by Opal Hendricks, senior analyst." She looked at him steadily. "Just that. My name, my title, what I did. That's all I've ever wanted." He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she felt it, a warmth under the surface of something she wasn't ready to name. "It'll say exactly that," he said, "and more than that if you want it." She didn't ask what he meant by more, not yet. What happened next was not what she'd expected, which was becoming a recurring theme. Galt's people had been moving quietly through the building since that morning. By the time Opal walked back to her office at 7 in the evening to collect her things, Aldridge Croft was being escorted out of the building by 2 men who were not building security, and the mole, a quiet, forgettable compliance officer named Renwick, who had sat 12 meters from her desk for 3 years, was already gone. His computer had been imaged and removed before lunch. Her office was untouched. Her whiteboard was still full of color-coded lines. She stood in the doorway for a moment looking at it. 3 years of building something careful and correct, and being told implicitly and explicitly that it didn't matter, that she didn't present well enough, move fast enough through the right rooms, wear the right things to the right client events. She took a photo of the whiteboard on her phone, not for evidence, just to remember. Her assistant, a 23-year-old named Blythe, who was very efficient and very kind, and had always remembered the way Opal took her coffee, knocked on the open door. "There's a car downstairs," Blythe said. "It's been there for an hour. The driver says it's for you." Opal looked at her phone. There was a message from a number she didn't have saved that said, "When you're ready, no rush." She looked at Blythe. "Can you water my plant while I'm gone? How long will you be? Genuinely don't know," she said honestly. She took her bag and her laptop and the photo of the whiteboard, and she went downstairs. The car was black and very quiet inside, and it took her across the city to a building she'd heard of but never been inside, in a part of the waterfront that looked one way from the outside, and entirely another way once you got past the lobby. Gould was waiting in an office on the top floor that had the same view of Lake Ontario she'd grown up looking at from the wrong side of all those years ago in Scarborough. He was on the phone when she arrived. He held up one finger, not dismissively, more like a person making a small promise, and finished the call in about 90 seconds and hung up. "Hungry," he said. "Extremely." He ordered food without asking what she wanted, and then looked at her across the desk and said, "I'd like to offer you a position." She thought about Aldridge Croft and his cufflinks and his comments about presentation. She thought about 60 hours of unpaid work and a memo that had sat unread for 8 months. She thought about standing in a boardroom at 7:42 in the morning with a coffee she never got to drink and understanding that the room had already decided she was the sacrifice. "What kind of position?" she said. "Independent forensic analyst, contracted exclusively to my organization. You'd identify financial architecture like what you found in Vero, wash cycles, embedded fraud, layered ownership structures. You'd have full access to whatever you need. Proper resources. A team if you want one. And the people whose finances I'd be analyzing? Dangerous," he said again. Plainly, without softening it, would I be in danger? "I would make sure you weren't," he said, and then quieter. "I would personally make sure of it." She looked at him across the desk. The light off the lake was doing something complicated to the room. He looked like a man who had spent a long time building walls and was not entirely sure what to do with the fact that he'd just let someone walk through one. "I want my name on my work," she said. "Every report, every analysis. My name. Done. I want to set my own hours, within reason. I want to be in the room when decisions are made based on my findings, not briefed afterward." In the room, he studied her for a moment. "Done. And I want the memo," she said, "the one Tolliver's signing. I want a copy sent to every managing director at every firm in the city who received the version where the department got the credit and I didn't." He paused. Just briefly. Something moved behind his eyes. Respect, she thought. Clean and uncomplicated. "That," he said, "I will personally send." The food arrived. It was very good, Lebanese, from a place she'd read about, but never made a reservation at, because it was the kind of restaurant that required the right kind of presence to get a table, and she had spent a long time being told she wasn't quite the right kind. She ate without apology, because she was hungry and the food was excellent, and the person across from her seemed not merely unbothered by this, but somehow specifically pleased. "You've been watching me since the boardroom," she said, between bites. "I have." "Why?" He poured water into her glass without being asked. "Because most people in that room, when they understood the position they were in, spent their energy on self-preservation. You spent yours on the problem." He looked at her evenly. "I've been doing this for 15 years. I don't meet people like that often." She thought about that. "People like what?" she said. "People who are smarter than the situation and calm enough to use it." She looked out at the lake. Somewhere out there across the water, Scarborough sat in the dark. The apartment where she'd grown up, 3 sisters and her mother, and a kitchen table where her mother had done her bookkeeping for the dry cleaner she'd run for 22 years, keeping the numbers straight with a pencil and a cheap calculator, and a precision that Opal had inherited and built a career out of. Her mother had never once been recognized for it, had never once expected to be. Opal had expected it quietly and persistently, in the way that people who have never been given anything learn to hold on to what they know they're worth. "I want a title," she said. "Not contractor. A real title. What title would you like?" She thought about it. Director of Financial Intelligence. He considered this for one moment. Done. She looked back at him. "You agreed to everything. You asked for reasonable things," he said. "Things that should have been given to you long ago." She held that quietly for a moment. It was a harder thing to receive than she'd expected. Not his agreement, the acknowledgement. The plain, unembellished recognition that she had been owed something and that someone was finally saying so. She didn't cry. She was not, in general, a crier, but something loosened in her chest, very slightly, like a knot that had been there so long she'd stopped feeling it. "One more thing," she said. "Name it." "The 6-minute lag in the Viro cycle," she said. "I know you know what caused it." "The look on your face when I mentioned it the second time. You recognized it. You've seen it before in another context, from whoever designed the original architecture." She looked at him steadily. Who taught them to build it that way? He was quiet for a long moment. "My brother," he said. She nodded slowly. She had wondered. "Is he the one you're actually looking for?" "He's been looking for me," he said, "for about 3 years. The Viro cycle was the closest he's gotten." A pause. "Until you pulled the partition and forced his hand. So I accidentally accelerated a years-long chase between you and your brother. You ended it," he said. "The documentation you built is enough to close every account, freeze every asset, and trigger extradition proceedings in 4 jurisdictions." He looked at her with that same quality of attention she was beginning to understand was specific, reserved, not given to rooms but to individuals. "In 48 hours you did what I haven't been able to do in 3 years. She thought about that. Where is he now? In custody, as of 2 hours ago. She hadn't known that. She absorbed it, and the Vero's accounts frozen. Being unwound. It'll take months, but the architecture is intact. Your documentation maps every layer." He paused. "It'll be used in prosecution. My name will be on it. Your name," he said, "will be on everything." She finished her food. She looked out at the lake. Somewhere in the city, in offices and meeting rooms and HR departments and group texts, the version of Opal Hendricks that people had decided on, too quiet, too much, not quite the right presentation, was becoming outdated. She thought about Blythe, watering her plant. She should send her something, a card at least. She made a note in her phone. "I should go home," she said. "I haven't slept in 2 days. I'll have the car take you." She stood up and picked up her bag and was halfway to the door when he said, "Opal." She turned. He was standing now, hands in his pockets again, and there was something in his expression that was more unguarded than anything she'd seen from him in 48 hours, which had been a long time to be in a room with someone and learn their expressions. "The plant in your office," he said. "The one your assistant is watering." She waited. "What kind is it?" She almost laughed. She hadn't expected that. "A pothos? They're very hard to kill." "Good," he said, "because I'd like you to come back for it." She understood what he meant, not about the plant, about coming back. "I'll need that second monitor," she said. "I work better with 2 screens. You'll have 3, he said. She walked out into the hallway, and then into the elevator, and then into the cool Toronto night. And she stood on the waterfront for a moment before the car arrived, and breathed in the smell of the lake. Cold and clear and wide. The same smell that had come through the window of the Scarborough apartment when she was 8 years old, doing her homework while her mother did the bookkeeping, both of them bending over numbers in a kitchen that was small but always warm. She had known even then what she was worth. She had just been waiting for the right room to walk into. The car pulled up. She got in. She watched the city move past the windows, lit up and indifferent, and entirely unaware that somewhere in a building overlooking the lake, a man who ran one of the most dangerous financial operations in the country was standing in his office, rereading a forensic report. And on the cover page, in plain black text, was a name. Opal Hendricks, Director of Financial Intelligence. For the first time in 3 years, it was exactly right.